Greetings, 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 and welcome to episode 14. This is episode 14 of CREWShall Conversations. CREWShall Conversations is a product of the KW magazine, Crucial Connections in Faith and Culture. And yes, we are here to have conversations about worship and cultural identity. We have these conversations primarily among people of African heritage, both on the African continent and in her diasporas. And we have these conversations because we want to get to know ourselves better. We want to get to know each other better. And ultimately, we want to build deeper, more authentic relationships with our Creator, Yahweh. So, welcome to episode 14. And in the room, we have some friends who are going to be helping to facilitate our interaction with you on Facebook. So if you are there on Facebook and you are watching this CREWShall conversation, we don't just want you to watch it, we want you to be a part of it. So tell us where it is that you are watching from. And we are listening out for your comments and your questions because it's a conversation, right? So Dana is in the room, Rosie is in the room, and between them, you will be seeing comments coming to help you have that conversation with us. So they will be the ones posting on my behalf, and they will tell us in the room what you are saying and what questions you have. So we really want to welcome you and say, come, make we worship through this CREWShall conversation. Now, I want to introduce you to Professor Robert Beckford. Yes, Professor Robert Beckford is our special guest right here on CREWShall Conversation, episode 14. Welcome, sir. It is good to have you.
It's a privilege to be with you. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, always. It's always just such a stimulating conversation whenever we get together. Let me just tell the people a little bit about who you are. So, and I found this on the Queen's Foundation website. So I hope they're up to date.
Yeah, should be.
Yes, I know. So Robert Beckford, PhD, is Professor of Black Theology at the Queen's Foundation. This is in Birmingham, UK, by the way. So whereas here it is 1 o'clock, over there it is 6 p.m. He is a scholar activist researching the intersections of faith and racial justice in and through diverse media texts. He has written a dozen books. Yes, that is 12, a dozen books, which triangulate the fields of theology, cultural studies, and politics. Beckford is a BAFTA award-winning documentary filmmaker, and you may be wondering, what is BAFTA? It is the British Academy of Film and Television Arts. So yes, he is an award-winning documentary filmmaker. He has written and presented over 20 films for the BBC, Channel 4, and Discovery USA. His films explore a range of themes, including political critiques of the British Empire, biblical history, and popular culture. Robert's creative reach extends into drama and Black British urban music production. Yes, music and drama. In 2017, his debut radio drama was broadcast on the BBC Regions. Jesus Peace is a fictional account of a reformed gang member turned Pentecostal preacher detective. Beckford's current research is a practical theomusicological project, the Jamaican Bible Remix Project. Taking the form of a studio album, the project inscribes Black liberation theology in urban music, grime, drum and bass, and UK soul. Wow. People, are you ready for this crucial conversation? I don't want to talk too much because really this is Professor Beckford's moment to speak all he knows and for me to sit at his feet and learn. And I'm telling you, you can imagine knowing all of this about this gentleman. Here was I in the UK getting ready to present a paper, which I I didn't feel so ready with. And I look in the room and who do I see? But Professor Robert Beckford, Beckford. He was not there for the whole conference, you know. He just turned up on this morning and I was extremely nervous. But the conversations that we had both inside and outside of the room were really meaningful and deep and certainly not intimidating at all. So here we are, and we really want to welcome you to this moment and to ask you the first question. Which part you're born, where you come from?
Yeah, thanks again for inviting me. To answer that question, I have to answer in two ways. First of all, I was born in Britain, in Northampton, which is in the East Midlands. However, second part of the answer, on my birth certificate, it calls me a Jamaican boy. So back in the mid-1960s, I was born 1965, you see the colonial citizens who came from Jamaica, the so-called Windrush generation, weren't viewed as British citizens. They were seen as immigrants, although they had their British and Commonwealth passports. I think the doctor who wrote my birth certificate saw me as a foreigner, and that's why he described me as a Jamaican boy. But I read it as kind of prophetic in that at my birth, you see, the doctor recognized that I needed to keep very strong connections with the Caribbean. And maybe one way in which I could maintain my Jamaican heritage was by viewing this birth certificate and seeing them call me a Jamaican boy. So I'm part of the Jamaican diaspora in Britain. My dad's from Westmoreland and my mum is from Portland. But I was born here, but I see myself as, culturally part of the Jamaican diaspora and politically part of the Black Atlantic culture.
Wow. So you are a Jamaican, really?
Well, my wife is bona fide Jamaican. My wife was born and raised in Portmore, you see, so she would see me as a Jam Brit, Jamaican British, and therefore not completely Jamaican, you see. So I'm happy to take that from you, see, to give me the full verification of my Jamaican heritage. That's good for me.
Yes, man. And I mean, your parents, one from Portland, one from Westmoreland. So it's like, far east, far west, and your wife from Portmore. Not really the middle, but, pulling everything together. This is good.
It's true.
This is very good.
Okay.
Yes, we actually have online Dr. Keith Burton is online watching us, and we are expecting. So people, if you are watching this, please share with your friends, because we are about to dive in to a very crucial conversation. Now, inside the room as well, and I am pretty sure that he may have questions toward the end, is Dr. Oral Thomas from the United Theological College of the West Indies. So I don't know if this is the day for the theologians to gather. here, you know.
Okay. Hello.
Greetings,
Yes.
sir.
Hello, Robert.
Hi, pleased to meet you.
Yeah. To meet me, I've met you before.
That's right. Well, pleased to meet you again through this disembodied medium.
All right. You look a little different, though.
Sorry?
Okay.
I say you look completely different.
Yeah. Well, the dread days are done now. You see, it's the days of
Oh yeah, that's not.
it's violent Christianity that I'm running with now. You see, the dread Christianity I kind of put aside 2010. You see, so a different version now.
Oh,
Wow,
okay,
wow,
good.
wow.
All right. Good to see you, though, Robert.
Thanks.
All right. Nice to hear your voice, sir. And we are looking forward to perhaps a question or two from you toward the end. No, we are having this conversation because of this magazine, the KW magazine. And in the very first issue, which was published last year, March, I believe it was 2019, there's an article here from Professor Beckford, right? No, you spoke about a project that you undertook, the Jamaican Bible remix, the Jamaican Bible remix. Now, before we get into even talking about that project, which was really critical, tell us, how did the Jamaican language become so important to you? And how did it help to cement your identity growing up in the UK?
That's a good question. And let me answer it again in two ways. The Jamaican language was subversive for me growing up. And it was subversive because our parents didn't want us to speak it because they thought it would disadvantage us in British society. And so they encouraged us to speak the Queen's English.
Yes.
So therefore, if I spoke Jamaican or patois at home, my father would rebuke me and would say, in the only way a Westmoreland man could say, speak proper Hinglan. I said that. It's not quite right, Dad, but I get the point. But the thing about it is when my dad would say that to me, he was signifying. He wasn't really saying, don't speak a Jamaican patois. Yes. He was just saying, be selective. Recognize that there's a time when you need to speak this way, and there's a time when you need to speak the Queen's English. That's what he was really saying. So it was subversive in that sense. And the second thing is, it helped in terms of identity because it was the way in which we communicated as young Black people to each other outside of the mainstream. It was what Paul Gilroy calls our politics of transfiguration. It was one of the ways in which outside of school, church, even home, we could speak to each other as young Black British people in a language that bound us together. So it meant a lot. It meant a lot in terms of home and my dad telling me that it was legitimate, and then what it meant in terms of being Black British. But what I would say is this, is that the way in which the Jamaican language evolves in Britain is very different from what happens in the Caribbean and in America. You end up with Jamaican in America. In Britain, you end up with a Black British, or what they now call multicultural English, because the Jamaican language and syntax is mixed with English syntax and grammar and West African syntax and grammar. So what you'll find now is that young West African youths speak a language, a street language, which is a mixture of Jamaican, West African, and English. So Jamaican language has contributed to a huge linguistic shift in British cultural life. It's massive. Multicultural English is fueled by the introduction of Jamaican people in Britain. So you listen to Stormzy, who's West African, is singing and using Jamaican words. He's stringing together phrases that come straight out of Kingston and Trenchtown or Morant Bay. Similarly, Jay Huss, who again is another West African grime is British hip hop artist, using Jamaican language concepts and ideas to paint his reality in his song. So it's subversive, it's identity forming, but it's gone beyond the Jamaican community now. It's part of British language, what they call multicultural English. That was on the bus a few months ago, well, before COVID, and I heard some youths talking, and they were talking about fam and brethren, and I looked around as white kids. I was thinking, you know, and that's the reality. So the Jamaican language has gone beyond the Jamaican community. It's now part of multicultural English. So the reach of Jamaican culture in Britain is massive.
And this is the thing I was going to say, that it's not just the language, it's the culture. Because, and the music, for example, I mean, I've been to many parts of the world and heard people pretty much revering Bob Marley and reggae music on the whole, you know, when it was born right here in Jamaica. So there is a thing about us that when we go into spaces, we have a tendency to take over. I don't know, but we're highly influential, and there's something about the things we put out that draw people for some strange reason. So,
yeah, I would say it's the culture of resistance. You know, it's the fact that you have people who come from an island that has a long history of violent settler colonialism, British violent settler colonialism, and a long-standing tradition of resisting that, both through psychological and physical and cultural means. And those traditions have been passed down. You know, our ancestors left us traces of these ways to resist. So I think it is about the material culture, the things that we create, but it's also the content of that culture, which is, you know, unique to the Caribbean and unique to the Southern Hemisphere. This tradition of resistance, this tradition of creating out of nothing and creating a whole new language, a whole new culture and ideas, you know, and having a great belief that the impossible is possible.
Wow. Very interesting. And Dana is in here saying that it seems that only we don't know what we have, the power of what we have.
Well, I would frame that a slightly different way. I would say that the power of colonialism, according to Stuart Hall, colonization wasn't just making people say they're inferior, but making them think it. You see, so I would argue that it isn't just that contemporary Jamaicans don't know what they have. It's also about decolonizing their identity and heritage and cultural production. Because, you know, part of the slave master's tradition was to make us think that what we create isn't worthy. So I think it's about decolonizing one's approach to Jamaican culture and recognizing that its true value.
So you're jumping in now to the topic we're supposed to be discussing is decolonizing worship. And you've just been talking about what the intent of colonization was, but let's look at the word worship. And what is your definition of worship? Let's stop there.
Well, that's a good starting. That's a good start, because I was raised in the Wesleyan holiness tradition in Britain initially, before moving over to the Pentecostal side. Wesleyan holiness tradition placed a great emphasis on worshipping in holiness and truth. You know, the spirit of holiness and truth was meant to be present in one's worship. And what they meant by that was that worship was a means of receiving God's grace, unmerited favor, but it was also the way in which you aligned your heart and will to the heart and will of God. So worship mediated the coming together of the will of God, God's truth, God's justice, with what God then required us to do as human beings. So I see worship as a means of grace. It's swinging doors. The doors open to heaven and heaven's doors open to you. And through that meeting of those two spaces, there's transformation. But there's a problem.
Yes.
You see, because the problem is that, and this is where we get into the decolonization, you see that the worship space in our colonial history, in the history of the diaspora in Britain, was colonized. And what I mean by it being colonized is that the mediation between God and humanity was biased. The worship, particularly the lyricism in the songs, was structured to maintain the colonial order rather than dismantle it. And in my work, I argue that the colonization of worship took place with three strategic theological moves by violent settler colonialism in the Caribbean, in Jamaica in particular. The first was regarding salvation. They gave us a partial view of salvation. Salvation was only for the body, the individual, never to do with the society or the system. So salvation had very little to do with dismantling the structures of slavery, changing the economic order, engaging in education. Salvation was always what I call biopolitical. It was reduced to me, myself, and God. It was, in terms of the cross, simply a vertical experience, not a horizontal experience. Second thing they did was they taught us to read the Bible on the surface. Colonialism didn't want us to read beneath the text to understand its history and the ethnicity and the ideas, because then we'd realize that God was a God of liberation. God was a God of justice. So they taught us to read Slaves Obey Your Masters, the Curse of Ham narrative in a particular way on the surface without understanding the depth, to keep us ignorant, you know? And the third thing that they did, what I argue, is that they taught us to hate our blackness, Afrophobia, what they call in the Caribbean. And that idea was in order to make us think that we were less than. And that's what I mentioned earlier on about the importance of what Stuart Hall says, when great dean of British sociology, that colonialism was about making you think you're inferior and acting it out. Well, colonizing worship also meant that the worship had to keep us in our place as Black people. So Black becomes bad, you know, and Blackness is ignored. Yes. Black identities are nearer to the devil rather than nearer to God. So that was part of the colonial theological tradition. And I argue that those three shifts are inscribed, they're ingrained in the songs that we were taught to sing. They set the parameters. So consequently, we know that worship is colonial when it only sing songs about God saving me. You know, or in Britain, God saving the Queen.
Yes.
Yeah, me, we sing about the Queen. We're so colonial here. Not even God save me. We don't sing songs about worship songs about God saving us as a community, particular communities, especially communities that are impoverished, poor, working poor communities. We don't say much about God saving us as a nation of people. God saving us as an underclass. God saving us in terms of people who suffer the double jeopardy of race, gender and race. In Britain, it's triple jeopardy, race, class, gender. You know, we don't sing songs about that. I don't know how many worship songs we sing about what God has to say about Black women's plight. 70-80% of families headed by a single parent. We sing songs about that. If worship is mediating God's truth with our world, then we need songs that connect these two. So for me, the coloniality is there in terms of what we sing about salvation. It's there in terms of how we sing about the Bible. We just read the Bible on the surface and sing songs about what's happening on the surface, rather than singing songs that deal with the complexity of the text and try to create an artistic narrative that addresses that complexity in the text and the complexity in our context. And we never sing songs about what God has to say about Black people. You know, 1 million songs written that deal with whiteness, because they're written by white people about a white God.
Yes.
One song, in Britain at least, the church, we talk about what God has to say to us as people of African heritage. So for me, that's the coloniality of worship. And as beautiful as the songs are, as much as they make you cry, as much as they fill you with the Spirit, they're still setting parameters on what God can do, influenced by violent settler colonialism in the Caribbean.
So, you know, it is interesting to note that you once again have gone deep, because I think some of us are still struggling with the basic questions of what language are we singing in and what music genre are we using? Because when you look at the worship space as being a colonized one, then and you see where it is the language that is typically the colonizers' language that is used almost exclusively across the board, say, for example, in the Jamaican context, so should we even be thinking about those things, or how do we place it in all that you just shared about what the colonized worship space looks like?
I think that's a fantastic question, and I would answer it with 2 points. Number one, language was also a site of imperialism, what the linguists call linguistic imperialism. What they mean by that is the history of Britain demonizing, outlawing, and brutalizing anybody who spoke African languages. That was part of maintaining the racial hierarchy of colonialism and slavery. So therefore, if the Jamaican linguists are correct, the retention of an African linguistic practice was an act of resistance during the slave and colonial context. And therefore, what we call Jamaican patois, patois is a derogatory term like Creole. It disparages what the creative linguistic practices that formerly enslaved people have. So I don't like to use Creole or patois. I prefer to talk about the Jamaican language. So for me, the Jamaican language is a bona fide linguistic system. I think Jamaicans are bilingual, and I think using Jamaican in worship is part of, this is the second part of the question, it is part of decolonizing the worship space. How can you sing the Lord's song if you're not singing it in your own language? It doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't make sense. So I think the Jamaican New Testament and songs in Jamaican signify decoloniality. You're saying, we're going to sing the Lord's song in our own language. We're not going to sing it in the language of the oppressor anymore, because the oppressor's language, as beautiful as it is, thank God for Shakespeare, thank God for all these great English writers, but it doesn't capture the complexity and beauty and majesty of our existence as people of the African diaspora.
Yes, wow.
So that's why in the Jamaican New Testament, we're going to get onto it, but the album project, we foreground the Jamaican New Testament, the audio, to make that point. We're using the Jamaican language because it is a decolonized linguistic space. It signifies African heritage and resistance to the linguistic imperialism of the British Empire.
But you know that there are some who honestly believe that the worship space must be holy. And for them, this is not a holy language. It is not a language that is used to express holiness. And so
I think that's classic coloniality, because what makes them think English is holy? I mean, English is a language that's a mixed language as well.
Yeah,
they got it from other parts of the world. The European influence, the Romans come along and change things. So the English language is no pure language. I think that leads us back to point number 3 of coloniality, which is Afrophobia, a fear of everything that's black. That was part of the colonizing process. Make them hate themselves. Make them think that what they do and think is pathological is less than. So, but just in terms of logic, it's nonsensical. English isn't a pure language, and therefore the question should be, what kind of language best does the liturgy? And liturgy literally means does the work for the community. It works for the community, empowers them. Well, it's got to be the language that the people speak. So for me, it's deeply problematic not to sing in your heart language.
Wow. Online, Dr. Burton had said earlier, during my youth in the United Kingdom, British Jamaican patois was the main form of communication among my peers. I didn't know where many of them were rooted in the Caribbean until I visited their homes and heard their parents speak. So, and I remember speaking with an Antiguan friend who was saying that, well, in England, everybody know you just don't mess with a Jamaican. So all the Caribbean people try to sound Jamaican.
Yeah, completely. Listen. I think there's something else that's happening there behind. There's two things behind that appropriation of the Jamaican language. One is the historical reality that Jamaicans who arrived in Britain in the post-war years took the full force of British racism and stood against it. So if you look at, for example, 1948, the rioting that took place in London, after the death of Colso Cochrane, 1958, the narrative of people who lived during that period tell us that there was fighting in parts of London, Ladbroke Grove, which was predominantly people from non-Jamaicans from the Caribbean, and they had to call on Jamaican men from Brixton to help them fight the the Teddy Boys who were coming there in 1958 to beat them up. So there's a history, Windrush Jamaicans standing firm against racism and resisting, and other people from other Caribbean islands having to use these tough-minded Jamaican men to help them resist oppression. That's a powerful piece of British history, which we often neglect. So the appropriation of Jamaican isn't just because of the beauty of the language, it's also because of the history of resistance of the people in these islands. So I was speaking a few months ago to a journalist, Afua Hirsch. In her book, she talks about the fact that up until she was 18, she's mixed heritage, and she would tell people she's Jamaican. The black part of her is from West Africa. It's because she wanted people to, because there was this cachet, this coolness of being Jamaican. And it wasn't just because of the culture, in terms of the music, it was because of what the people stood for. So again, we're talking about outer national Jamaicans, in terms of America and in terms of Britain. There have been some really important people and developments that are directly linked to how we interpret our heritage and the meaning of Jamaicanness and the meaning of the language.
Wow. It's interesting that you mentioned that mixed race person, because the next issue of the magazine is talking about that whole issue. We wondered if we should call it schizophrenia. We wondered if we should call it split personalities.
I think the reality is, look, number one, none of us are pure, and hyphenated existences are powerful existences. So being African, Caribbean, British, Jamaican, it's what Du Bois termed double consciousness. We've got the gift of second sight. We can be both inside and outside of a situation. So, mixed heritage is part of that hybrid identity tradition, which we Caribbean people carry within us. So some people would see it as an evolution of where we've come from in terms of our mixity. What makes it questionable is just the scale. You see, because the fastest growing demographic in Britain are people of mixed heritage at this point in time. And so people are kind of, black women in particular, saying, well, hold on, well, these black men not marrying black women, that's the issue. And it's led some then, particularly African-American scholars, to look at the way in which black family life has always been under attack. And so while some read this mixed heritage as an evolution of Caribbean inclusivity, always been inclusive people because we recognize we're mixed in many respects in terms of our African and our European heritage. Others who see it as a subliminal attack on black family life and lateral love, because loving black people, black men loving black women, with black women loving black men, has always been demonized in British history from day one.
Wow.
So to the point where today, in terms of television, it's very rare to get see black people in love is a rarity. You have to take it down. My goodness, there's two black people, it just doesn't happen because, so some people would, so there's two ways in which that's kind of interpreted here, you see.
Wow. That is.
But let's get back to talking about the language.
Yes.
So for me, the language then, you see, I foreground in the album. The album is called the Jamaican Bible Remix. It's free to download because it was funded as a social enterprise. And we foreground the Jamaican language, but we use other language systems as well, Black British, and dialects from Birmingham, from London. Because what we're trying to do through these mix of languages, this mix of voices, is demonstrate that the kingdom of God, and even blackness, is diverse. You know, and our linguistic traditions are ways in which we interpret the world, and all of the language systems that we use on the album are all come out of black people's experiences. Theologically speaking, what I suggest in the book that accompanies the album is that language, the Jamaican language, is a form of atonement. It atones for the sin of slavery. It atones for the sin of linguistic imperialism. And how does it make it right? Because it connects Jamaican people back to their true heritage and identity. It connects them back to that African heritage in the Caribbean, and therefore it atones for it. And
wow.
British language, you know, atonement theory, you know, isn't just about Jesus dying on the cross, because that's the kind of old school Christus Victor approach, the violent approach where somebody's got to die for redemption to take place. Womanists, black feminists, focus on the life of Jesus, how Jesus saves in life, not just only in death. And how does Jesus save in life? Transgressing boundaries, always mixing in between the little people that nobody wants to know about, the woman at the well, Zacchaeus, transgressing. And what I argue is Jesus is transgressing in the New Testament. The stories where he boundary crosses, it's also a linguistic practice. You know, it's kind of what we call in Britain code switching. We're speaking for 1 minute and we go into Queen's English. You know, so I'm arguing, you know, the way in which we do language, code switching, is also a kind of atonement theory. You know, it's atonement in life. It's the way in which in life we recognize that language has power. It has power to pull people together, because Jesus crosses boundaries to pull people together. And that's what Jamaican language has done. That's why when I looked at the back of his white youths, you know, so our language has this atoning power. If atonement means making right, bringing people together, people who are broken and separated, the language has that pulling power. It does that. Asian youths engage with it. Black British youths, white British youths, has that kind of power. So for me, the Jamaican language is an atonement. It's an atonement practice in the Caribbean and in Britain.
Yes, you know, it's so interesting when you mentioned the connection, because it reminds me of when a lady in my home church who is from inner city Kingston, Tel Aviv, and when she heard my comical worship album, when she heard it, she called me, she said, Sister Joanne, the album just connect, and it connect me with God. And, it's so clear.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I'm seeing this whole atonement thing, and I'm seeing how deep and how serious it is, and wishing that our leaders would realize this. Now, there are a lot of people who have joined us on Facebook, and I know we're getting into the conversation, and it's not that we're forgetting you, but you know, it's kind of difficult to drag yourself out of the middle of this kind of conversation to see what's happening here. But earlier on, Rosie McLegan-Hines had asked the question, what about the fact that we are worshiping a white God? Before we even talk about worship, we have to talk about who, what, and why. Pause. I know you have a response. I just want to make sure I catch all of these things. So Dr. Burton is saying, in my estimation, colonial Christianity has been the most powerful tool used by imperial powers to quench the spirit of liberation, not only in its individualizing of salvation / liberation, but in its emphasis on the world to come. It effectively de-emphasizes the importance of community and encourages people to be content with their order in the oppressive caste system. Yes.
Yeah. I look, there's two really good questions. I think the first one, we need to put to bed the idea that there is historical whiteness in Jesus. Jesus was a first century Palestinian Jew, so therefore Jesus has color. You know, it may not be rosewood or mahogany, maybe teak, you know, or whatever, you know, but Jesus is a person of color. So let's acknowledge that first of all.
Okay.
But let's also be suspicious of the way in which European Christianity made Jesus white. There was a whitewashing of Judaism so that Jesus became a European. And that's what we've had to wrestle with. So on the one hand, let's acknowledge that the biblical story takes place in a kind of mixed ethnic environment where African people play a role. Comparing that with what European domination of the Jesus imagery. In fact, I have give a quick advert. I have a World Service, BBC World Service documentary on this on the 18th. It's called Black Jesus. Going on the 18th of December. It's called Black Jesus, and we just explore what the Black Jesus means, especially in light of Black Lives Matter. So we need to acknowledge that Jesus is a person of color. The Christ of faith they made white. And what we're trying to do through Black and womanist theology, Caribbean theologies, is get back to blackening the Christ of faith. And what we mean by that is not that we're saying Jesus was an African. What we're saying is that the way in which we interpret the story of Jesus is through our African Caribbean heritage. We're trying to do that in order to work out what the God of faith has to say to us within the particularity of our situation. So we need to recognize that there's a tension there. Jesus ain't like that. It's what the Europeans did, and we have to deal with that. So we have to blacken the biblical tradition, blacken our understanding of faith. And that's really important. Regarding colonial Christianity, I completely agree. Look, in my last book, Documentaries Exorcism, I call colonial Christianity an occult force. It was co-conspirator with the evil, the viciousness of colonialism. And it has never exorcised itself in regards to that history. And what I mean by that is there's never been any kind of meaningful repentance. 2007, the church acknowledged that it played a role in slavery and said, sorry. You say, sorry, that ain't enough. Give us back the money. Build a monument. Inscribe these issues within theological and training. Never did any of that. More recently, this year, the new Archbishop of Canterbury said, we're really sorry for the fact that over the last 65 years, we've treated Black people terribly. What are you going to do about it? They had 161 recommendations since the 1990s to implement in the Church of England for racial justice. Never implemented one. So that isn't just ignorance. That isn't just theological solipsism, ignorance. It's actually spiritual oppression. They need to exorcise the demon of racism that entered into the body of the European churches as a consequence of its sojourn with racial terror in the killing fields of the Caribbean. That requires, that's obia. That's white people obia. And you need to be exorcised from that. Now, will they hear it from us? No. Because part of the obia mean you don't listen, you don't hear what Black people say. We have to tell white people, liberal white people to go and tell them. Because they talk about the God of the oppressed, but they don't want to listen to the oppressed. So yes, I completely agree with that. But here's the good news. The good news is we've consistently decolonized it. Jamaica has been in the forefront. First liberation theology in the 20th century is Rastafari. For all its weaknesses, for all its potential misogyny, for all its lack of coherence, it did the work of challenging the soteriology, broadening what it means to be saved to encompass identity, history, culture. It did a critical reading of the text, even though they were concerned with Babylon and the Africanization of the text. And they also did the work in terms of loving Blackness, made that integral to one's faith. So there's a template there to work with in the Caribbean in terms of what has happened in Jamaican history in particular. So I completely agree with those things. How do we do that in worship? Quite easily. We write songs that talk about a God who's concerned with all of life. We sing songs about the educational system. Lord, let your spirit come and deal with the inequality. That means that people who are rich get the best education and poor people don't get nothing. We can't even afford it. Lord, we need songs that say, God, help us to get the money together to send the kids to school. You know, what do you have to say? What the same way that the widow's mite was multiple. Or what about us? What about the songs? Because we need to spark people's spiritual imagination, singing about all of us. We need to say, Lord, what are you going to do about the environmental change? We've got to move the capital. The waters are going to come. Lord, what does your word? You say that the earth groans for the coming of the children. Well, what does that mean in terms of the climate change issues that we're facing. And Lord, maybe we need songs that encourage us to think about the pollution, the scandal bags populating the beaches, the sewage going out, the raw sewage going out into the sea, the throwaway culture, the consumer. We need songs about that saying, Lord, don't let me throw away this stuff. Let me keep my stuff. Maybe help me to be environmentally friendly. We need those kind of, so we need a broader soteriology. We need to open up the minds of the musicians so they can be poetically engaged in crafting songs that get us to think more broadly about the meaning of God in the world. Similarly, what I tried to do with the album is take critical readings of the Bible. So rather than just reading on the surface, second layer of coloniality, taking interpretations of the Bible beneath the text and engage in a conversation with it. So one of the tracks on the album is called Social Justice. And we look at the narrative is based on a critical reading of Luke, Jesus's introduction to his ministry in the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus talks about borrows from Isaiah. So critical readings of the text and creating songs in relation to that, rather than just reading it on the surface and asking critical questions, you see. So our songs then can become much more critical, challenging. We have that in our popular culture already. Got Bob Marley's song, One Love. One Love was questioning about, what about that? What about that? We need songs like that in church. What about this, Lord? What, you say this in your text, but we need our artists, our worship leaders to do that liturgy, the work of the community. And similarly, third level, we need songs that empower Black people, that talk about a God who loves people whose skin tone is dark, those who darker than blue. You know, that's what we need now. You know, we have them in the secular charts. You know, some of the African-American brothers and sisters have attempted to do this. Look at Sounds of Blackness, Black Butterfly. What do you think they're talking about there? Yeah, they're talking about Black people. They're talking about a black butterfly in some Brazilian Amazonia. It's about Black people. So we need to find ways in which we celebrate the way that God has made us and not feel ashamed of that, and doing it in song, in Sunday morning, so we can say, God, we thank you that you made us this way. We thank you for these big lips. People paying money to have lips like this. Thank you, Jesus, mine come free. Lord, people going to plastic surgeons to get a bottom like mine come free, no charge. Hallelujah. Hey. I want to say, you know, so I want songs that celebrate all of who we are, because this is how God made us. Lord, thank you for all bringing us this far as a diaspora, because people have been trying to kill us, and they didn't do us in because of your grace. Let's be explicit about it, and let's see where the Spirit leads us. You know, the imagination. Where's the Spirit going to? What kind of Christian is that going to create? What kind of activism is that going to create? You see, broader soteriology, critical readings of the text informing our musicology, our hymnody, and then a loving of Blackness coming through in the worship, spreading out to the diaspora, making those connections. It's powerful stuff.
And what I think people need to realize is that empowering and speaking positively about our Blackness is not a negation of people's other colors or other skin tones. We don't need to feel that we are exalting ourselves.
Oh, no, not at all. Oh, no, not at all. But let's reverse this. You know, we have a history. We have a 500-year history where the songs were written by people racialized as white to celebrate their reality. You know, so we can be equally critical of that. But we're recognizing that what we're doing is contextual. We're saying, thank you, Lord, for this. We're not saying we're superior. We're not trying to oppress anybody. We're trying to get free.
Yes.
From the stuff that's out there that says every day you don't count, every day that you're less than, every day if you become a little bit lighter. We want songs that work against that, because we know the Spirit of God works against that. Now, the problem that we face in doing that, you know, I mean, what I'm saying is the material is there, the ideas are there, is that much of the machinery producing the worship music comes out of violent settler colonial culture, North America. How did the Australians get on the scene? I said to my students, look at what these churches are doing back home to the Aborigine people, and you're singing their songs. We've got asked critical questions about the love ethic that's coming out of that context with that brutal. How come they don't sing songs about redeeming that brutal history? I can know they sing songs about giving their land back to the Aboriginal people.
Wow.
You know what I mean?
Wow.
So I'm asking critical questions in the same way.
And I think there may be one or two, but they are not being highlighted. We're not hearing them. Hey,
Sure.
you know, the musician, the songwriter from back in the day of the early revival movement in 1860, I suspect that this particular song may have come from that era. And it's I feel me Jesus too. I feel me Jesus too. I want you to know. I feel me Jesus too. I feel me Jesus. And make me clap it so. Because I mean, back in those days, worship, as you said, was supposed to have been in quietness and in, you know, reverence. And clapping and dancing were considered to be
Completely. I think there are echoes of it. You know, when my parents used to sing, God is not dead, he's still alive, I can feel him in my hand. That wasn't just about celebrating God physically. It was saying God was in black bodies. So those got excited, not just because they could feel the spirit, but because the spirit was inhabiting black flesh in a world that said black flesh didn't count. It's really, really powerful. So here's what happens. We signify it. We do it in code. What I'm calling for is something much more explicit. And that takes moral courage. You can't do this if you're afraid. You can't do it if you live by fear and not by faith. You can't do it if you're not prophetic. Real prophecy, 90% of the prophet's work was speaking truth to power, empowering the people. 10% was clairvoyant. Oh, next week this will happen. What we've done with prophecy is reverse that. 90% is clairvoyant. See people on Facebook, always prophetic word. I think, what are they going to say about the government? What are they going to say about what? Oh no, they're giving you mysteries of God. That was only 10% of what the prophets did. 90% was about the social justice. So it's, you know, they've reversed it in order to make prophecy easy. You know, so they don't get, they're not accountable. So I think it takes a kind of real prophetic vision to do this kind of work within worship. And sadly, very few of our preachers, teachers, even worship leaders have moral courage, faith that will stand firm against injustice, and are willing to be prophetic in that they're willing to speak truth to power, as the 8th century prophets did, as Jesus did. You know, so that's the challenge. Now that's challenged me. Now, what I did with the album was attempt to model that. How do we then have the moral courage? How do we be prophetic in our songwriting and in our music video making, so that we challenge people to see salvation more broadly, read the text critically, love blackness.
The challenges. Marcel Goff, Mebununu's husband, has said colonization, wow, so much more damage than we realize. Give thanks for Jesus who came to set the captives free. And Bertram Gale, who, by the way, was the one who led the project in translating the Bible, the New Testament, into the Jamaican language. Thank you for being right there, Bertram, and putting your more than 2 cents, your 2,000 cents in. He says maybe we should talk more about the issue of language beyond our indigenous languages, to the issue of how we celebrate blackness by using the words and images of black, darkness, night, etc. in songs, sermons, etc. That are not exclusively negative as they are now.
Completely. But the you know, the scholars will know that in the biblical tradition, in the Old Testament, dark doesn't always mean bad. You know, the Hebrews, for example, follow a dark cloud, and God inhabits that darkness. Hebrew words used during the burning bush is that Moses looks into a dark bush. Darkness is where God is found. It's in the New Testament where we get this dichotomy between light and darkness. And then in church history, light and darkness become ontological qualities. They have being. Light being goodness, darkness meaning badness. So, you know, that's where the problem sets in. However, I think we can create songs where we play with that language, where we celebrate darkness as being good. In fact, I have an African-American friend and scholar who refuses to sing those songs when they talk about light and dark in that way, where darkness is bad. Equally, when the gender is problematic, I remember him singing quite loudly, you know, the song where it talks that we shall be called the sons of God. Oh, what manner of love it is, blah, blah, blah. And he would shout out that we should be called the children of God. That we can shout it out. Why? God just doesn't have sons. God has daughters too. You know, and you know, it extends in terms of modern human sexuality. He would challenge us in terms of how he was singing. So I think that's part of it. That's the challenge of the new Black musicology. And therefore, within the album, there's one track called Payback, which is about reparations for slavery. And you see, if love, Martin Luther King used to say that love in public is justice. So how do we love Blackness in public? We do justice. That song is about reparations for slavery in a gospel song, because in the Paul's letter to Philemon, Paul offers to repay for the damage that's done. Well, what happens if we globalize that? Then we have a God who's a God of recompense, not just restitution, you know, or a God who's concerned with restorative justice. Not retribution, but restorative justice as well. And therefore, how do we sing about a God of restorative justice in terms of global politics, reparations movement? You know, because maybe if we opened up people's imagination, they start to ask different questions. Now, the Spirit hasn't been with the church on this. It's moved beyond the church. So secular people have been raising these questions, and it's the secular people now who are pushing forward this agenda in Britain. You know, so we're missing the boat often. We're missing the Spirit's work because we're not singing the songs, I would argue, that ignite the spiritual imagination to think more broadly, complexly about faith, more globally, more politically, more retrospectively in terms of dealing with the coloniality. So there's the
huge challenge.
Well, the songwriters are the teachers.
Huge challenge.
Teaching.
And speaking of God having daughters too, I want to just big up and greet Becca Whitler. Becca says, hi, Joanne, greetings from Canada. This is fantastic. Greetings to Dr. Beckford. Remember Becca, right?
That's
from
right.
The same conference.
That's right, yeah.
that we met at. And Mr. Bean, Errol Bean, and Denver Hamilton are on as well. So Bertram is saying, so Caribbean theology needs to inform our hymnody.
Completely.
So the challenge really is that we are perhaps not doing enough of the theology that will inform our hymnody.
Yeah, and part of it is because of the dominant, hegemonic music making machinery for worship comes out of North America, coming now out of Australasia, with the Hillsong songs coming out of Europe, and they're not being informed by our life experience or our life history. So it's deeply problematic. The challenge of the theological colleges in the West Indies is to bring the theology together with the songwriters, with the worship leaders, running seminars and thinking about how you take these ideas further. Now, we're doing that. I did that with the album. I worked with gospel artists, some secular artists, and I've got another project now, which is all about working with the worship leaders to write new songs, to think about the environment in a particular, rethinking how we think about the environment from a Christian perspective. So that's the challenge. Bring them together on Zoom, run the seminars, socially distanced, of course, and say, here are the key themes within a Caribbean theology. How do you sing songs that address these issues? A God who is a God of justice and liberation. Where's that in your songs? You know, because if you're just singing about a God who comforts you, that's part of it. We want a God who actually enrages us with righteous rage to address the issues.
Yes.
You know, we don't just want to think about the Spirit as the comforter. We want to think about the Spirit also in terms of 2 Thessalonians, where the Spirit is a defensive force, holding back the evil.
Yes.
You know, so we want to, so, you know, I mean, in fact, the Paraclete is a helper. It's an offensive force. In fact, that's the way in which I sing about the Spirit on the album. There's a song about the Spirit on the album called The Work of the Spirit. And looking at the Spirit's work as offensive and defensive. And what that means then to say that you're filled with the Spirit. Wow. You're doing work that's both offensive work out there, challenging the system, as well as defending the weak and the infirm, you know? So that's what I'm trying to get at is Caribbean theologians need to do that work
Yes.
engage with the musicians, run the seminars, do
Yes.
the work so that they rethink the songs that they're singing.
Wow. Okay, so in the room, we have Noel Wallace also he's a worship leader at Presbyterian Church, United Church in the Cayman Islands. And he wants to make a comment about the situation in Cayman, the cultural situation in Cayman. Of course, you know that the Cayman Islands are still owned, I don't know if that's the right word, by Britain. It's a British colony. Okay, yeah. So talk to us now, Noel.
All right. Thank you, Joanne, and greetings, Professor, and others who are on this Zoom or Facebook. I'm driving, but I hope I'm audible. Prof,
I don't want to see anything bad happen, you know. All right.
Okay, yes, it's close to the road. Prof, you have been very, very enlightening. Joanne Richards and I were been friends for many, many years in ministry and etc. And she has been to the Cayman Islands several times in the whole matter of promoting a worship that's culturally relevant, etc., etc. I want to speak as a Jamaican diaspora, but who is just across the road in Cayman Islands. Although it is so close, there's still a lot of cultural search for, still a lot of search for cultural identity. Let me narrow it down to say probably two schools of thought. One is that, of course, we're a British colony, so Mother Britain rules us, and whatever she says, we drum to the tune. We're also very culturally influenced by North America. So we have a lot of the trappings of that in our culture and etc., dress and so on. The other school of thought is that we belong to the Caribbean, and Cayman wants to find her own song, her own tunes, her own style. And as Joanne knows, I'm not only a music minister in the church, but I'm also a part of the Cayman Islands folk singers, because I want to play my part in helping us find our songs and our tunes. And they are out there, but it's just a matter of the larger population not necessarily owning it, and especially the young people. A lot of our cultural things, the maple dance and so on like that, is kind of dying out with the older generation. So we want to pass on the baton and let the young people appreciate and value our own. All right, now that's just the background. What I want to share with you, Prof, is that when I say we are still heavily influenced and run by Britain, but most of the expats who come to work are from Britain, and a couple from US and Europe and across the world. In fact, we both have over 102, 105.
Whoops.
Oh dear.
Come back.
Nationalities and the numbers keep counting. But those who come from Britain, here's my big point, and are coming, and what we're talking about, the problems we're facing. And I'm saying that if they come, they seem to have a bigger clout than the Caribbean expats who are here. For instance, even in the teaching, those who come from Britain, the Caribbean teachers, I would say, sir, are far, far more excellent. But it's just a matter of the clout. They come from Britain, they get the red carpet treatment, they get a higher salary, better perks, etc., etc. And with North America and Europe as well too. And they come also with their slant, the white Jesus slant, and that sort of thing you have said. So if more persons like of your persuasion could get the jobs to come here, that's what point I'm making.
That's where you're going with this.
That'd be great. Well, I'm more than happy to.
That would change.
I'm more than happy to spend some time there. But I think you've raised some really important. I think you've raised some really important points about diasporic experience and how that can lead to an imitation and reproduction of the hierarchy, rather than actually pulling us together and thinking in terms of the old Pan-African identity. And it sort of raises questions about the need for a new Pan-Africanism. There is a version of it in the North Atlantic, which Paul Gilroy develops through his work on the Black Atlantic, this idea that there's this diasporic culture, which is relatively uniform because it's quite hybrid. And that works for some people, but others want to pull in the African heritage as part of this Black Atlantic experience and foreground it in a much stronger way. So I think you've raised some important points about how the old hierarchy is being played out amongst Black people in terms of our class hierarchy, and how that needs to be challenged. The white Jesus is part of the Black Atlantic experience, and decolonizing the white Jesus has to be part of that experience. And what we're saying here, what I'm saying is, people listen to more songs than they hear sermons. Therefore, let me raise this. I put it out there. The songwriters and worship leaders are holding the coloniality in check.
Wow. Okay, I hear the challenge.
Yeah, and that's part of my struggle because, for instance, tomorrow we're having our Christmas cantata, and each year I ensure we have some Caribbean Christmas songs in it. And but the majority material might come from North America, or etc., or might have African sing Noel. And I make sure we have some of that in there. But yes, and Joanne has tried for us to raise up songwriters who will be more culturally relevant.
Completely. And let's be more blunt about it. Many of the songs that are coming from North America are coming out of places that were committed to Donald Trump. So we've got to ask questions. What kind of Christian imagination supports racist, misogynist, white nationalist thought, and then craft songs with the other side of the brain about a loving, caring, inclusive? They don't do it. So in many respects, many of the songs coming out of the American right evangelical church tradition, equally the Australian right evangelical church tradition, it's really soft power for white supremacy.
Yes. So we actually were supposed to, it's supposed to be a 1-hour conversation.
We're Pentecostalized. We decolonized time. We kind of decolonize the time. We're working on a time frame that's outside of the violent settler colonial mindset. So we just keep going as the spirit leads. So the album, let me just say, the album is still free to download. If you just do a search on the Jamaican Bible remix, the album is free to download on SoundCloud. There are 4 music videos as well as part of it. There's a book coming out next year with Bloomsbury called Decolonizing Gospel Music, a Black British Praxis, which is the theology behind the decolonization of the music and how particular theological ideas coming out of Black British experience, Caribbean experience, help rethink those colonial categories. So teleology, interpretation, and the ideology of anti-Blackness, and how we can then write songs that challenge that. But let me just say this, I'm not saying that we just need to sing all of those songs. The cross is horizontal and vertical. We've just got it's just that we have these vertical ones. What I'm trying to say is we need these horizontal ones that are contextual as well to have a full gospel. Yes.
And just want to identify Barbie Shivanai, who's online, not even sure I'm pronouncing the name correctly. And Marcel Goff was saying, somebody was bringing Owen Blacker Ellis into the conversation. And Marcel was saying to him, it's not just the music we want like a musical, all the art forms. And of course, he's a visual artist, so he does not want to be left out of this whole scenario.
Completely. It's vitally important. It's vitally important. Yes. But look, let's be political about this in the sense that the music that is being conveyed, the ideas, the theological ideas that we find within the North American music and the way in which it's filtered into Caribbean music is loved by authoritarian right-wing regimes. The Brazilian church loved the stuff. So the Brazilian Bolizario loves the stuff that the Pentecostal churches are doing because their songs affirm individualism,
Yes.
capitalism, you know, but they do it through by talking about individual hard work and God blessing the state and all of that, and a strong nationalist identity, you know.
Yes.
So these songs, they're not neutral. They are theological. They're not neutral. They are coming from somewhere and they're presenting a particular worldview. So if right-wing authoritarian politicians see these songs as helping them, and we know that right-wing authoritarian politicians have never been good for us, we've got to start decoding these songs and asking what kind of Christian imagination is just making us feel good about ourselves.
Yeah, this is really what has been in my mind percolating for a while now. If we unquestioningly embrace a theology of a people who used that theology to justify the negative treatment of our forefathers, does that signify some kind of mental ill health?
Yeah, I think there's two parts to it, because sometimes we can appropriate it and make it our own. In the same way we did that with Christianity, slave religion. So there's a tradition.
That is why I use.
We can rework it, but I would see that as a first phase. We appropriate it, give it a different meaning. Slavery is done. Empire is done. Let's now write our own stuff that is actually much more explicit about the issues, our theology, our contextual experience.
Yes.
And that's what we're calling for. So I would say personally that we still need that mixed economy. Some of those songs bring back memories of my mother and my father and their faith tradition, about my grandparents. That inspires me. But my children and their children need songs that help them adjust to the modern world in which we're in and the place of Black people within it. And they can get it from hip hop, they can get it from grime, they need to get it from gospel music as well.
This is why I was saying unquestioningly embrace. So it's not to say that we must discard all of it at all. It's just that we must think, we must process, we must question so that it is relevant to us and that we are not just without thinking taking on someone else's perspective.
Completely.
So as I said earlier, we have in the room Dr. Oral Thomas, and he also has a question and perhaps a comment. Maybe we have a question for you, Dr. Thomas. Before you come on though, I want to take this opportunity to invite persons who are watching now to join us on the 26th of December. Let me just share my screen here. Join us on the 26th of December at 6 p.m. Jamaica time. So I know that the people who are in the UK are going to have a challenge with that time, but we will be doing it again after this. So if the 6 o'clock Jamaica time is too late for you, we will be doing it again at an earlier time so that you can come in. But this movie called Joseph can be a game changer for people who are having a challenge with their perception of their Africanness. It is about a young Jamaican doctor whose father's family was marooned from a compound, and his grandfather had begged him, please go back and find your people. You are Ashanti, do not forget it. So it is a movie, as you said, if you want answers to questions about who you are. We're going to put up the link for how you can actually get access to it just by making a donation to Crew 44, which is the body behind the KW magazine and the CREWShall Connections, and also to the filmmakers. So the donation you make will give you access to that film. Okay, let's come back now, and we have Dr. Oral Thomas. Dr. Thomas, go ahead, sir.
Right. Thank you so much, Robert. Robust and insightful as usual. I don't know if this is too personal and sort of timid to ask you, but I look at it as you're evolving, because when I came on and saw you, I said, "That's not Robert." So I was wondering if it is not too personal, probably this is your journey, and I'm sure that is part of your journey. Because earlier when I spoke, when in the introductions, you talk about this is you spoke about your dread days, the dread Christianity, and and I think you said the ballad Christianity. I personally, if you care to, if you can, if it's not too personal, would appreciate a comment on your evolving in that, in terms of.
I think that's a fair question. I think that's a really good question. I think I would answer it in
But by the way, that's not my question though.
Oh, really?
Just let me ask the question, and then you could comment on. Robert and colleagues sharing this platform. I don't know. We have been, at least I have been struggling, because we talk about the person who spoke about raised the question who, why, and what of worship. I think is spot on, and the worship theology informs our worship, and worship informs our theology. And so therefore, when we look at what is happening in the Caribbean, because we're talking about colonialism, and we're talking about Protestantism, and we're talking about Pentecostalism, as our friend from Cayman alluded to earlier. And I'm wondering, Robert, is it to what extent is it the case that in worship, the Pentecostal way of worship is contextual? It is contextual, and the theology, given all that has been been going on in the decolonization of theology in the Protestant church here in the Caribbean, that the work done in particular by Caribbean Conference of Churches and others, both as we are saying multicultural, not just in the church, but the cultural artists as well. That the worship in the Protestant church is so colonial. And in the Pentecostal church, it tends to be a lot more contextual. But somehow when it comes to the theology, the Pentecostal seems very colonial, very countercultural in their theology, whereas the Protestants tend to be a bit more progressive. To what extent is that the case?
I think that's a really good analysis and two really good questions. The first one, in terms of the evolution, I would answer it in three ways. One, to say the central research question for me when I started my postgraduate studies was, how can we make Black Christianity more politically engaged? And so for the first part of my inquiry, and it's the second part of the answer, it was about a correlation between Pentecostalism and Rastafari. And that was the dread theology. How can we use ideas within Rastafari thinking, particularly the notion of dread, to rethink the work of Jesus in the world, and hence the book Jesus is Dread, and later Dread and Pentecostal and God of the Rotted. All of those were attempts to do that kind of correlatory work. After 2010, though, I shifted my focus to thinking much more about colonialism and the coloniality as a response to reading Walter Mignola's work on the continued influence of colonialism as a form of coloniality and this matrix of power, the way in which colonialism may have disappeared as a political force, but it still is retained through a structural force, what it left us with. So I started to think about how that impacts Christian theology and how my work had indirectly decolonized. My work in film in particular was decolonizing Christianity, and that led to the book, the last book, which was documentary as Exorcism, and looking at colonialism as an evil force that needs to be exorcised in the contemporary world, both in terms of mainstream churches and Black churches. So that's the personal journey. And the next book is Decolonizing Gospel Music. So I'm still working on the colonial theme as a way of addressing that central research question. In terms of the tension between scholarliness and worship in both contexts, because that's the way I'd frame it, I think it's really a product of history. Generally speaking, if your context is like ours, if you are a Pentecostal pastor, you're less likely to be seminary trained. You see, so because of the way in which they haven't trained their ministers through an apprenticeship scheme or through a scheme where if you just feel you're called by God, you go and preach. So consequently, Pentecostal churches, if it's the same in Jamaica as in Britain, have one of the lowest levels of theological training in the country. Maybe 2%, 3%, maybe 5% theologically trained. What I mean by that, have been to seminary or even have a bachelor's in theology. Very, very small percent. So consequently, the worship might be contextual, because that's the tradition of Pentecostalism from Azusa Street. Western Pentecostal tradition was always about the Spirit coming down and meeting people where they're at. But the Spirit hasn't told them yet that they need to go to seminary as well. The converse, I think, has happened within the mainstream churches, where seminary education is normative. People read the books by Cone, by Lewin Williams, by yourself, and they are then conscientized to think theologically. But they haven't necessarily translated that work into challenging the liturgical history and structures and the songs that people sing. What you really need is a tradition that will do both. You know, what we've been trying to do here in the UK to address that is working with Pentecostal pastors. So my current work at Queen's in Birmingham, we have 40 Black postgraduates from the Black church working with us, 10 PhD students, 30 MA students. When I was working in Canterbury, the project that I established in London was to specifically train West African pastors. So the course of 5 years, we trained over 100 West African pastors in theology with theological training. And that's one of the ways we've attempted then to bridge that gap within Pentecostalism, developing a theologically articulate but pneumatologically powerful Pentecostal church leadership. That's what we've been trying to do within this context. And I can tell you this, it's not easy, because here's the thing about the Theological Academy in Britain. Blackness doesn't pay. You know, and what I mean by that is you get less research money, less research time, less resources if you're committed to empowering Black people. That's that. So you know, so this is self-sacrificial work. If my work was working with white students, as in a white institution, I get all the resources thrown at me. But I've made my commitment through the dread days, through to now, my commitment has always been to turn out theologically equipped Black clergy. So Dulcie McKenzie, who I work with, one of my former PhD students, Anthony Reddy, who is teaching at Oxford, started this theological journey with me when I was first teaching at Queen's in the 1990s. So most of the people who are doing the work at the moment have come out of the projects that we established at particular points in time to empower Black people. So it's not just for me, Black liberation theology hasn't been just about the talk. It's about, can we then empower people to go and do afterwards?
Well, thank you, because the group we had at Birmingham University that we used to have once per week with folks in the diaspora, from Kenya, Caribbean, and so on. We really thank you for the guidance and the leadership you gave during that time at Birmingham University. So I associate with what you're saying. And thank you, Robert.
My pleasure, my pleasure. I hope to see you again. I'm looking for my invitation.
we have to get you to the college, man. Don't worry.
No, definitely. You just tell me when you want me, and I'm there. Okay, I'd love to come and do some work there.
Okay, good. All right.
Yes. So this is great. Thank you very much, Dr. Thomas. And what we are getting coming out of this at 2:22 now is that, number one, we need to use music and the arts to communicate and to inspire, to inform, and to mobilize the people of African descent to embrace their Blackness, as well as to act in the world, bringing justice and equality and this kind of a thing.
Yeah, and I'm going further than that. Let's be hardcore. Jamaica is experiencing a new wave of colonization from the Chinese. You've got to be asking yourself, what does God have to say about this new wave of our resources being taken away, this new wave of our leaders colluding with people who don't have our best interests at heart? What do we have to say? What do you have to say, Lord, about an economic reality now, which means that even when we're going to the shop and spending our money on a little food, the wealth is going out of the country? Yeah. What does the Bible have to say to people who have been consistently walked over in this way? And what's the response from the church? And that's what we're saying. We need songs about Chinese neocolonialism.
Wow.
It's in the Bible, because the Hebrews experienced that. People come into their land, take what they have, disorganize them, disparage them,
Yes.
you know, and they cry out to God. We need you. Look what they've come in and they've taken everything. They've laid everything to waste. This isn't the first time, Lord. What are you going to do about this? Because we know if this continues to happen, we'll have nothing. And we can't just rely on the eschaton. We need meat on the plate now.
This is what I was just thinking about, that this is really, you know, there is this struggle with my identity is in Christ. And therefore, these things are secondary or non-issues at this point, because my identity is in Christ.
And that's part of the coloniality. But that is part of the coloniality, because the people who taught us that didn't think that. Their identity was very much, their ethnic identity was interwoven into their Christian identity. And they found, and sometimes they found the ethnic identity to be the Christian identity. The English Israelite movement, English exceptionalism, that's what it was partly about. What we're saying is, actually, God cares about every aspect of human life.
Yes.
And therefore, to have an identity in Christ does not then take away from your ethnic and social identity. Jesus was still a Jew.
Yes.
You know, God sent the Son of God to be a colonized Jew.
Yes.
God was saying something about identity there, that identity matters.
Yes.
You know, it matters to God, and it's inside of salvation. God wants to save that too.
Yes. Wow. And so this is where we are going to wrap up this crucial conversation today. And we have been challenged, especially those of us who are involved in the arts. We cannot pretend that we didn't hear this. We can't unhear it. We have heard, and we need to respond. So people, let us prayerfully, not in our own strength now, because anything that is done in our own strength is bound to fail. But we have the promise of the Holy Spirit. And so let us embrace what we have and move forward to do what we have been sent to do. Decolonizing worship. So many of you have come on, and it really has been a rousing conversation. And as we close out, I want to let you know that, well, first of all, you may support this project by purchasing the PDF version of the KW magazine. I think Dana is going to put that up in the comments section, the link where for only $5 per issue. And you really want to get on board in terms of paying attention to when the next issue will be out, because we are almost ready to share that one. It definitely is coming out before 2020 ends. And it is about how we balance our Africanness with our Europeanness and all the things that happen in between. I must let you know also that next week, Saturday, is our 5th wedding anniversary. And so we have not, thank you, we have not planned an interview conversation, and we're still in the process of working out exactly what we will do, but you will see us even for a short while next week, Saturday, and then it's the following week, Saturday, that the movie will be, but it won't be at this time. So pay attention. The link is in the comments as well for how you can register to watch the movie. So, Professor, it has been real and it has been good. And for all the others who are in the room, Noel and Dana and Rosie and Dr. Thomas, we just want to tell you, thank you. Dr. Burton is saying great show. Thank you. Professors Joanne and Beckford and Dwight Kelly is saying great conversation. Time for deliverance. It's way past time. So, may I beg God for bless you and keep you. May I beg him for smile upon you. Me I beg him for show no him love, even though none away, not deserving. And me I beg God to look upon you and go no in peace today and tomorrow and the next day until he come back. You know what good and one love.
Amen. Amen.
Amen.